Welcome back to Project PhDcast. I am your host, podcaster, podcast researcher, PhD student, Alison Innes. This podcast is an audio diary of sorts of what I am thinking about, learning about, ideas I'm putting together as part of my PhD research into podcasting practices, particularly humanities podcasting. One of the things I really love about research is reading a lot of diverse sources and bringing those ideas together in new and interesting ways. And I think the article I'm going to talk about today is a great example of that. It's not at all about podcasting, but it really connects with some of the work and the thinking that I'm doing about true crime podcasts. I have a huge stack of articles here. Yes, I like to print things off so that I can highlight them and mark them up. And obviously, I'm not going to share them all with you, but one that I read recently that really made me think about things about true crime podcasting a little bit differently is this article titled True Crime, The Origins of Modern Sensationalism, written by Joy Wiltenburg in 2004 and published in the American Historical Review. And I keep forgetting that 2004 is actually a really long time ago. It's actually 20 years old, so that makes it a little bit of an older source. But it is still a very useful and a very interesting story for thinking about true crime podcasts. So Wiltenburg is researching the sensationalized crime stories from 16th, 17th century Europe, German language, the stories. Who is reading these, circulating these, kind of what their cultural role is, and addressing some of the questions or ideas at the time. And this is in response to conversation around sensationalized true crime. And whether that's like kind of something that's kind of new with television and news reports and all of that kind of stuff. And she's saying, no, it goes back a lot longer. And again, looking at it in terms of the role that these stories play in a culture and how they actually function. I looked at this article because for a specific quotation, which was on the first page, but I'm really glad that I kept reading beyond that, because what these sensationalized crime stories from Europe are doing, I think, are a lot like true crime podcasts or, Netflix documentaries, whatever, are still doing today. And this is just some of my initial thoughts. I haven't necessarily fleshed all of this out completely yet. But one of the things that she highlights in this article is how clergy collected these stories. So these stories would be printed with woodcut illustrations, and then people who had the education to read and the money to buy these pamphlets would buy them and read them and circulate them. And so clergy, some clergy collected these stories and used these stories to reinforce moral and religious teachings. So here's what happens when you aren't walking a straight and narrow path, and you're leaving room for the devil to get into your life, and all of these terrible things can happen. And some of these stories are, like, when you think about them as real people, are pretty horrific. So, parents, like a parent that kills an entire family, for example. There's a couple of examples of those in here. And with the religious aspect, again, there's an idea that these stories help with showing that kind of sin opens up the space for bad things to happen, or for somebody to do bad things. But the stories, as they are told, include a what I would call kind of the return of the wrath withdrawal return. She doesn't frame it that way. That's my thinking from my mythology background. But the stories show how the criminal is punished in some way, but is always kind of reconciled to God at the last minute, in the sense that they go off to heaven and they're saved. And that religious framework kind of depicts sin and punishment as underlying criminal activity. Now, the true crime that we're listening to, and I'm thinking here of, in particular, of the super popular podcast, My Favorite Murder. We listen to these stories, we watch these stories, we engage with them. And there is an element in these stories that's meant to kind of instruct. that's one of the motivations for listening to true crime is to think about, okay, so if I were in that situation, what would I do, or how would I avoid getting into that situation? And that's a bit of a slippery slope because it does veer into victim blaming, which is really problematic in its own right. But there is still in true crime this element of trying to understand how to protect oneself. So that has been identified as one of the motivations for women in particular listening to true crime, is that there's an idea that we can learn from it how to be safe and how to protect ourselves. And if we get into find ourselves in a bad situation, that we have some ideas of how other people got out of bad situations and how we can do that too. So there's still is kind of that teaching, that moralizing element in true crime today. And another thing that these 16th and 17th century true crime stories were also doing was kind of reinforcing the political authority for punishment, right? So they show how there's this really horrific, traumatic crime that happens, and then that justifies political officials stepping in and punishing the criminal with in some rather grisly executions, right? So there's also this functioning that telling these sensational crime stories legitimizes the punishment. It legitimizes the politician's authority to punish. And so that's really interesting in thinking about how true crime stories operate today and what kinds of messages they are giving us. And of course, thinking in particular what those nuances are when it comes to police who are telling true crime stories. So there's some interesting ideas in there that I haven't completely worked them out yet, but hopefully at some point you will see me do that. Another idea, of course, is that these stories, like Wiltenburg talks about how these stories shift from being really focused on the victims, particularly children who are murdered by their parents, and they're really sympathetic to the victims. There's a shift in time of the stories towards trying to understand, or I guess we would kind of say pathologize, the criminal and understand what their motivations are. And of course, in a religious context, it's presented as the sin and the devil. But I think there's still that element in true crime stories today, where one motivation or one reason people listen to them or enjoy them is trying to understand what makes somebody act like that, right? So something really traumatic or dramatic happens. I mean, there was just something in the news yesterday on April 19th. Somebody did something really horrific to themselves in a really public setting, and the instinct is like, why did somebody do this, and what were their motivations, and that's kind of what we kind of glom onto, and we want to understand it, right? And maybe there is an element that if we understand it, we can prevent it. Maybe it's just curiosity, but there is this idea of wanting to try to understand what makes somebody do something bad. So there's kind of also that element. And like I said, these stories she talks about, she points out that they have a kind of that reintegration, that forgiveness moment, or that redemption arc for the criminal. And I think that that's really interesting too, because then it's kind of saying something about how the not just the crime, but the criminal themselves might be viewed. Wiltenburg talks as well about the emotional impact and the emotional appeal that these stories have, and their kind of rhetoric. And again, that's something that I am looking at with some very specific podcasts at the moment, thinking about what the words are that they use, how the story is told. Again, Wiltenburg points out very specifically kind of this propaganda angle of how you use these stories and how you present them. You can present a very specific or a very strong argument for example, government authority or government action or political action. So I found this article very, very interesting. And it was one of those articles that kind of leaves my brain buzzing. There's a lot of things in here that I still need to kind of think through and think about how they apply to my research. But because it kind of came from a perspective, from a different medium rather than podcasting, and from a different time, it kind of pointed out some elements of what we see in and what we talk about in true crime podcasting in a slightly different way. So that was a fantastic article. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Project PhDcast, an audio research journal created, hosted, and produced by me, Alison Innes. And you can, as always, find links and article information in the show notes. Please share your thoughts with me. Get in touch with me through my website, link in the show notes. Learn more about the research project there and how you can participate if you are a podcaster and would like to share your thoughts. Music for this episode is called Grand Dark Waltz by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com and is used under Creative Commons license. You can view this podcast with subtitles on YouTube, and transcripts are available for download by request. Project PhDcast is an ongoing project by Alison Innes, PhD student in Interdisciplinary Humanities at Brock University. This research project has been approved by the Research Ethics Board at Brock University, file number 23020 MAURO.